Hello, this is News for Scotland. Week ending the 8th of December. I'm Hugh Stewart. Myself and the team, Joe, Jeanette and Yvonne, have compiled this week's top stories for you. Features coming up later on what to feed your birds in the winter, Scottish Trad Awards and much more. All that's coming up. It's News Where We Are. And our first story this week, earlier on Thursday, the Scottish Government lost a case in the highest court in the land, the Court of Session in Edinburgh. They were trying to block a Freedom of Information request from a citizen, Mr Harrop, who had asked under FOI law to see certain documents relating to the failed prosecution of Alex Salmond. These documents were compiled by James Hamilton, the independent investigator, who was asked by the Scottish Government to look into whether the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon had misled Parliament when she explained her role in the Salmond case. His report in 2021 decided that Miss Sturgeon had not broken the ministerial code, but his background evidence was never released. The Scottish Government for some reason tried to block publication and for the first time ever took the Information Commissioner to court in order to prevent Mr Harrop from seeing the documents. The three judges took very little time to throw the government's case out, so the evidence will be released in due time, but possibly with some redactions. Certain names or sections may be deleted. In trying to keep these documents secret, James Muir KC argued for the government that the documents belonged to Mr Hamilton and not to the government, and so they were not compelled to hand them over. It didn't take the three judges long to decide. The court president, Lord Carloway, found against the government with a simple phrase: "The court is satisfied that the information involved was held by Scottish ministers in terms of statute, and we will therefore refuse this appeal." We at News for Scotland have no idea why the Scottish Government was so determined to block Mr Harrop's FOI request. Have they something to hide? What evidence will be revealed when the papers are released? We are anxious to find out, and we'll certainly let you know as soon as we do. And now the story this week about Scotland's educational standards. The latest PIZA international comparison of school pupils' performance was released on Tuesday earlier this week. PIZA is the programme for international student assessment, and it finds that Scotland's educational progress faces challenges, though it's not all bad news. But first, where are the problem areas? Scotland's performance in maths was lower than in every previous PIZA study. Reading standards were lower than in the previous study in 2018, and science performance was similar to the 2018 study, but that was lower than in previous years. PIZA surveys cover over 80 countries and show marked differences between Europe and countries in Asia. Star performers in this latest study include Singapore, Macau, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan and South Korea. They perform especially well in maths. In France too, commentators are concerned, talking about an unprecedented decline in student performance. Hugh from the OECD said that COVID had brought down results across all countries, but this was not the only reason for falling performances. Some countries, for example Japan, actually improved their performance during the pandemic. In conclusion, a conclusion which could also be applied to Scotland, French experts are saying that COVID accelerated a decline which had already set in about 10 years previously. Similar concerns have also been expressed in Germany and Sweden. Scotland's 15-year-olds did, however, perform well in their Level 5 exams, with figures higher than the OECD average. At Level 2, however, Scotland's performance was below average. The Scottish Conservatives said that these new OECD standings are a devastating indictment of the SNP's long-term mismanagement of Scottish education, and they pointed to the fact that Scottish pupils are, in this study, scoring below the UK and the OECD average in science. However, on the good news, Scottish pupils do feel that they are welcome in school, with strong scores suggesting that they feel that they belong and the school is a welcoming place for them. The PIZA study, conducted by the OECD, asks 15-year-olds and their schools to take part. About 96% of invited schools and 80% of invited pupils did take part in the study in Scotland, and that's a very high return rate. And interestingly enough, Professor John Robinson on his blog yesterday said that the return rate in Scotland is a much higher percentage than in England, so perhaps that ought to be kept in mind. If you're comparing Scotland with England, you might not actually be comparing like with like. Now let's move on to immigration policy at the UK. Scotland and the UK government going in opposite directions. Just 2 weeks ago, the Scottish Government published the proposals for immigration in an independent Scotland, showing how Scotland needs more people to deal with the natural decrease in Scotland's population and to ease labour shortages, particularly in the care and hospitality sectors. This week, the UK Government announced plans to cut immigration and prevent people coming to work here from bringing their family members with them. Here's Stephen Flynn of the SNP this Wednesday taking the issue up with Prime Minister Sunak.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is the Prime Minister worried that he is projected to be the first Conservative Party leader to lose a general election to a fellow Thatcherite?
We really must hear the Prime Minister, and we've got a lot of questions to get through. It's not the Prime Minister's opponents who are giving him trouble. Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I say to the honourable gentleman, Margaret Thatcher's view was cut inflation, then cut taxes, and then win an election, and that's very much my plan.
Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just in relation to Margaret Thatcher where the Tory and Labour leader appear to agree. The same is true of the Government's latest migration policies. Now, for those of us on these benches, we aren't afraid to say that we believe migration is a good thing. It enriches our communities, it enriches our economy, it enriches our universities, our schools, our health service and, of course, our care sector. So in that regard, can I ask the Prime Minister, why does he think it is acceptable to ask people to come to these shores to care for our family members, whilst we show complete disregard for theirs? What has become of this place?
And that was Stephen Flynn earlier this week in the Westminster Parliament. The noise that started that clip followed his taunting Keir Starmer for coming out earlier on as a fan of the free market thinking Margaret Thatcher. Now back to Scotland. New prison policy for transgender prisoners. New policies were announced this week to change the way trans-identifying prisoners are housed in Scotland's prisons. The policy focuses on so-called trans women. That refers to men who want to be treated as women. Earlier this year, one dangerous male sex offender was originally placed in Cornvale Women's Prison because he announced during his trial that he was now a woman. The new approach says that any transgender woman with a history of violence against women and girls and who presents a risk to women or girls will not be placed in the women's prison estate. If the Scottish Prison Service, the SPS, doesn't have enough information about an individual, they will be locked up according to their sex at birth. Even prisoners who do have a GRC, a gender recognition certificate, may still be locked up according to their original sex if, as the SPS says, it is considered necessary to support people's safety and well-being. Once staff had enough time to assess an individual, there remains a chance that prisoners may be placed according to their preferred rather than their original sex, but those choices will be made on an individual basis according to a risk assessment. If an individual has to be body searched again, this may be done according to the person's original or the required sex, but again this depends on an individual assessment by prison staff. One commentator, Lucy Hunter-Blackburn on Twitter X, doubted whether the SPS is able to accurately predict whether a male prisoner will or will not turn violent when deciding whether they should bang him up with a woman who has no means of escape. The new policy is due to come in at the end of February 2024. And now the funding crisis for councils. This week, COSLA, the overarching body for Scottish councils, has issued a warning that some Scottish councils may have to declare themselves bankrupt. COSLA President Shona Morrison said, "We see the headlines in our local and national press about the difficult financial choices councils need to make, deciding whether to reduce or even cut vital services and ending funding for essential charity and community partners. Unfortunately," she said, "councils have no choice but to protect core statutory services, especially with the unprecedented financial challenges we are all experiencing. Budgets are tight, creating risks to many other local services our communities rely on, such as programmes supporting children and young people, sport and leisure facilities and public transport." A spokesperson for the Scottish Government said, "Scotland is facing the most challenging budget settlement since devolution as a result of sustaining high inflation and the UK government's autumn statement that failed to deliver the investment needed in Scotland's public services. The Scottish Government has increased the resources available to local government in this year 23-24 by more than £793 million, a real terms increase after inflation of £376 million, which is 3% more compared to the figures from the last year, 22-23. The Scottish Government continued that work is ongoing with COSLA to establish a new fiscal framework for councils through the Verity House Agreement, a landmark agreement that's forging stronger partnerships between the Scottish Government and local councils through the spirit of collaboration and engagement. And finally, the government spokesperson said that decisions on local government budget allocations for future years are subject to the outcome of negotiations with COSLA, the results of which will be confirmed in future Scottish governments. However, the immediate budget we're looking forward to is going to be on the 19th of December. Thanks. That report was from Yvonne Alexis. OK, let's go back to Scotland at COP28. We reported a couple of weeks ago that the Scottish Government was among the participants, the Conference of the Parties 28, the latest United Nations conference dealing with climatic change. We'll summarise the COP's outcomes later. That'll probably be next week because the COP is still going on. But first, let's look at Scotland's contribution. When COP26 met in Glasgow 2 years ago, the Scottish Government promoted the Loss and Damage Initiative. This is a fund to help developing nations both adapt to the environmental damage caused by climate change, which rich countries are responsible for, and to help finance clean and green technologies. Hamza Youssef, speaking at Heriot-Watt University's Dubai campus, said earlier this week that Scotland's initial £2 million investment has now turned into funding promises of over £500 million as countries like America, Germany and the Emirates are taking up the initiative. This week the Scottish Government also announced the green energy funding for projects in Zambia, Malawi and Rwanda. 15 children's hospitals across 3 countries will receive $324,000 to install solar electricity systems providing clean and reliable energy. Another $250,000 goes to mini electrical grids in Zambia and Rwanda to assist the transition away from unsustainable and polluting cooking methods. The First Minister said that initiatives like these would show that small nations can have an impact on the world stage and that Scotland, which led the world into the industrial age, can also take a leading role in the transition to net zero. COP28 is due to end at the 12th of December and we'll prepare a summary of its decisions in next week's edition. OK, environment again. Sellafield pollution. The Scottish Government doesn't, of course, support new nuclear power, as we have plenty of clean alternatives. However, one of England's largest nuclear facilities is very close to Scotland. Here's a report by Dr Joe Murray on our pollution exposure to the reprocessing plant in Cumbria.
Hello, this is Joe Murray for News for Scotland. When the British Government decides to rename a problem, you know it's a real problem. In 1957, a fire at the Windscale nuclear processing facility in Cumbria was the UK's worst ever nuclear disaster. It has not been the only one, but it certainly was the worst. There have been problems at this facility throughout its entire life. In 2019, one of its buildings, the Magnox War Storage Silo that stores toxic sludge known as B30, developed cracks and began to leak toxic waste into the ground surrounding the facility. This leak significantly worsened over the next 2 years. B30 is the sludge from ponds that is designed to keep submerged used nuclear fuel rods from power stations. This leak, most liable to affect local groundwater, is believed will continue until 2050 and according to official statements could have potentially significant consequences. The Guardian newspaper has spent a year investigating the leaks at this huge nuclear dump that lives on Scotland's doorstep. According to The Guardian, a memo sent to board members at Sellafield, as it is now known, raised concerns over a degradation of safety processes across the site and warned of cumulative risk from, among other things, failing in nuclear safety. A scientific advisor to the UK Government has said risks posed by the sludge and other chemical leaks at Sellafield have been pushed firmly under the rug. It's not the first serious leak at Sellafield. In 2005, a leak of highly radioactive liquor containing around 20 tonnes of uranium and plutonium closed down the Thorpe reprocessing plant for 2 years. There have been many concerns in other countries about continuing problems at Sellafield. An EU report in 2001 warned that an accident at Sellafield would be worse than Chernobyl. Sellafield holds significantly more radioactive materials than Chernobyl. Leaks may be through the base slab and through both primary and secondary walls. Ireland and Norway in particular, but including other Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark and Finland, are concerned that an accident at the plant might release a plume of radioactive particles that could be carried by prevailing winds to their lands, devastating their ability to grow crops. This is not an unfounded concern, as in the 1970s and 80s, air pollution from UK power generation plants carried on prevailing winds caused severe acidification in Scandinavian lakes and rivers and stripped whole forests bare. The leak at Sellafield is around 2.5 cubic metres of liquor from this sludge, and it's been leaking every single day. If I tell you that 1 cubic metre of water weighs 1 tonne, then if we count only from October 2020, this facility has released over 1,000 tonnes of toxic waste into the surrounding environment in Cumbria. By 2050, a serious fire notwithstanding, 11,000 tonnes of this waste will have been released into the immediate environment. According to an Office for Nuclear Regulation report, says that risk from the current leak is as low as practicable. This is a statement that means nothing, really. The word low is meant to put you at ease, but low as is practicable doesn't mean as low as necessary. It simply means as low as we can get it in the circumstances, and this means it is likely to be higher than it would like it to be. Semantics is a wonderful thing. The subtle differences in meaning is important here. Sellafield is a major part of the UK's nuclear weapons programme, and there have been many allegations over cover-ups over the years. This includes that serious fire of 1957. It was the worst nuclear accident in Europe until Chernobyl. For many, fire safety is now once again a real concern at Sellafield. Lack of transparency by the UK government over these leaks is also a cause for concern, not only for the Irish and Scandinavians, but also the UK's close partner in nuclear technology, the USA. America's concerns are the cracks in the concrete at the toxic ponds, and a lack of transparency from the UK about the problems at Sellafield. Ireland has tried to take action against the UK. In 2006, it referred the UK to a UN tribunal over concerns of the impacts on the environment from Sellafield. Norwegians are so troubled by all of this that they're talking about giving money to Sellafield to ensure it is maintained properly and open about its problems. Senior staff at Sellafield say they are proud of their safety record and that they always strive to improve. Our employees are empowered to raise issues and challenges when things aren't right, said a spokesman. A worker at Sellafield told The Guardian, "They can't handle a fire or asbestos on site, let alone the crumbling of nuclear containment materials." A scientist on the medical aspects of radiation in the environment was quoted as saying, "It's hard to know if transparency is put aside because no one is brave enough to say we simply don't know how dangerous this is." That Ireland and the Scandinavian nations are all deeply concerned about Sellafield and its continuing safety problems, not least the serious leaks. Why are so few in the UK being so vocal about this? What is the Scottish Government's view on this? The Welsh Government's? Energy and Defence are retained to Westminster, but surely the health and safety of Scots is non-negotiable. If Norway's fears are ever realised, I certainly wouldn't like to live along the Scottish border or in Lothian, but then the whole Scottish Central Belt and beyond is at risk of prevailing winds carrying such terrible pollutions. On top of that, Sellafield has apparently been under cyber attack this week by foreign agents. However, the British government has disputed this. I don't mean to alarm you, but I think you should know the dangers that are on your own doorstep. Till next time.
OK, now let's look at the opinion polls. SNP still ahead. In Scotland we don't have many opinion polls, but one was released at the end of November, and the pattern looks the same as over the last 2 years, with the SNP lead slipping and Labour catching up. Looking at Westminster voting intentions, the Ipsos poll from the end of November puts the SNP on 40% and Labour on 30%. 2 years ago, over 50% of Scots voters would go for the SNP. It's assumed that the next UK elections will be sometime in 2024, although Sunak could, in theory, hirple on until January 25. So will the election be spring or autumn? There's more speculation that Sunak might gamble on an early election, maybe next May, before next summer's peak of small boats over the Channel. Anyway, whenever he calls it, it looks like he's going to lose, unless he has a secret plan to conjure a miracle. A November poll UK-wide shows the Conservatives on 22%, while Labour remains miles in front at 45%. So looking at the Holyrood elections, which are not due of course until 2026, here the SNP still looks like the largest party. On voting for your constituency MSP, 39% would go for the SNP, and that's 9% down on the last election. Labour are 5% up on 27%. With the Tories coming a poor third on 15%, we can see that the bulk of those local MSP seats will again go to the SNP. On the list section of the vote, where the maths gives a boost to the parties who didn't do well in the first section, the SNP still leads on 33%, although that's 7% down. However, most of those seats will go to the smaller parties. This is where Labour, Greens and the Conservatives will win most of their MSPs. Alba on 2% here don't appear likely to get anyone elected, although they are polling 3% on the constituency section. The Scottish Parliament has 129 members, so any parliament or coalition with 65 or more can form the Government of Scotland. These latest figures suggest possibly 56 seats to SNP and 10 to the Greens. So at the moment it looks like another pro-independence majority, although that's a slender lead. On independence, this Ipsos poll gives yes a clear lead. 51% would vote yes to independence and 43% would vote no. Now when you take the don't knows out, that leaves you with 54% for independence and 46% against. OK, back to the SNP again, and the SNP's president is seeking new pastures. SNP President and former Government Minister Mike Russell has announced that he's off to work with the Scottish Land Commission. This body was set up by the Scottish Government following the Land Reform Act of 2016, which began to address the ancient patterns of land tenure in Scotland. The Land Commission explains on its website that they are working to create a Scotland where everybody can benefit from the ownership and use of the nation's land and buildings. Land reform, they say, can reduce inequality, improve the quality of life and support and benefit everyone in society. Maybe Mr. Russell should have a word with Andy Whiteman, who has new proposals on land reform on his blog this week. Former MSP Andy Whiteman, a long-time campaigner for land reform, has announced his latest proposals on his blog, although no longer a member of the Parliament because he resigned from the Green Party in 2020 and couldn't hold his seat. Mr Whiteman suggests the urgent measures which need to be taken. Briefly, his overall purpose is to democratise land governance and in particular to strengthen the role of local communities and local government to secure a more widespread ownership of land. His underlying philosophy is that land should be treated as a common resource, whereas Scotland it often plays a role as investment capital. To cut out overseas ownership, the Whiteman Bill would force landowners to actually live on their land or close to it. The bill would also include measures against monopoly ownership of land. People or companies would be limited in how much of Scotland they can possess. This bill, of course, is not really a bill, it's a suggestion. It would have to be taken up by an MSP and supported by one of the Holyrood parties for it to make any progress. However, for more information on what Andy Whiteman proposes, look at www.andywhiteman.scot. Let's look at London and the UK. COVID Enquiry. On the 6th of December, former British Prime Minister Johnson gave his most explicit apology for his handling of the coronavirus crisis. That was this Wednesday. He said that his government had been too complacent and vastly underestimated the risks posed by the virus. Speaking at the official inquiry into the UK's handling of the crisis, Johnson said he takes full responsibility for all decisions and that he understands the public anger after the inquiry heard of government incompetence, backstabbing and misogyny as it battled the biggest health crisis in decades. Johnson said COVID-19 had first appeared as he put it, a cloud on the horizon, and not the typhoon that went on to cause more than 230,000 excess deaths in Britain, and in fact many millions more. Initially, Johnson said he did not believe the forecasts of fatalities because previous health scares such as the swine flu pandemic and mad cow disease ended up with much lower death totals than first expected. But Johnson admitted only reading the minutes of the government's key scientific advisory group on a couple of occasions, despite the conclusion leading to the biggest restriction of freedoms in Britain since World War II. Britain had been an outlier in Europe at the start of the pandemic when large public events remained open despite nightly news programmes showing chaotic scenes in Italian hospitals. The former Prime Minister faced repeated questions about whether he waited too long to impose a lockdown at the start of 2020, and if that resulted in Britain ending up with one of the worst death tolls from the pandemic. Amar Anwar, the Glasgow lawyer representing some of the COVID families who were bereaved, said that Johnson oversaw what he called a deadly culture of impunity and incompetence and treated people like toxic waste. The inquiry held evidence from former advisers that Johnson wanted to let the virus spread rather than order another lockdown, and he once replied, "Let the bodies pile high." The inquiry continues. Meanwhile, let's go out into the garden.
Hi, this is Joe Murray, News for Scotland, and we're at that time of the year where we all like to get our bird feeders out and make sure our little feathered friends in our gardens and beyond are fed and kept warm for the winter. But what I would like to talk to you about today is some of the things not to feed them. Because inadvertently some of the stuff in our kitchen, the scraps of food that we sometimes put on our bird tables, can actually do more harm than good. So I'd like to talk to you today about some of the things that you shouldn't feed them, because I know none of us want to actually hurt these little creatures. So I'll start with potato crisps and other types of crisps like that. Snacks. Although potato chips are not prized for their nutritional value and are considered junk food to us, they can in theory be safe for birds, but all that salt and saturated fat is not doing them any favours. Feeding them a steady diet of potato crisps could eventually result in obesity and kidney problems, like humans. They could also become addicted to junk food, like humans, at the expense of finding more nutritional feed. Additionally, the additives and preservatives found in many potato crisps could be poisonous to some birds. So, if you can, don't feed them crisps or those kind of snacks. I know some birds will come and eat them anyway, but on the whole, it's better not to feed them. They'll go look for something more nutritional if you don't give them those. Nuts. Now, nuts are great for birds. The fat in these high-calorie snacks are healthy and keep them flying, chirping from dawn until dusk. Nuts can also help keep their plumage in tip-top condition. Almonds, Brazil nuts, pecans, peanuts, walnuts and macadamia nuts can all be a quality source of food for a huge variety of birds. However, I'd like you to be aware that anything with salt or dry roasted written on the packet is an absolute no-go. Peanuts, either straight from the shell or crushed, have been a popular choice of food to put in bird feeders for years. But don't make the mistake of thinking you can just pour the leftovers from your packet of dry roasted straight into the feeder. You can't, it'll do a lot of damage to the birds. Birds are not built to digest that much salt, and it could make them extremely sick, and in some cases it could actually kill them. It's also important never to put whole, unsalted peanuts out during the breeding season. Remember that when they're actually nesting and breeding, because if the birds feed them to their chicks, they run the risk of accidentally choking their chicks. So it's better to keep the peanuts for the winter time, or later on when the birds have fledged. Chocolate, yeah, that's a thing, isn't it? Like dogs, birds are unable to stomach chocolate because of the theobromine content, and it's pure poison to their palates. This is derived from the cocoa plant, and the theobromine in chocolate is an alkaloid from the same family as caffeine, which is also toxic to birds. Dark chocolate, of course, is particularly dangerous for them, and their extremely fast metabolism means the effects of theobromine will be fast-acting. And this can create symptoms including vomiting fits and heart attacks. So don't put chocolate on your feeder. I know you think there's fats and that in it, but it will not do them any good. It will do them more harm than good. Okay? Garlic. You know, garlic's got lots of health benefits for us, and it can help boost our immune systems, reduce blood pressure, lower cholesterol, whatever, but it's not great for birds. Garlic contains a chemical called allicin that can play havoc with the bird system, cause lethargy, anemia, vomiting and diarrhoea. These are not good for anybody, especially small birds. And like garlic, onion, great for us, liven up dull dishes, but they should also be strictly off the menu for birds because onions have a high sulphur content, which can aggravate a bird's digestive system and damage the insides of their mouths and stomachs. So we don't want to be giving them garlic or onion. Give that to me, I'll have that anytime. Honey, yeah, because of its sweetness and high energy properties, birds will naturally be drawn to honey. But just like humans, they don't always appreciate that something that tastes so good can be quite bad for them. It can also be quite acidic and interfere with the bird's digestion process. Honey is also lacking in the high levels of specific nutrients that birds require, and its high sugar content can be quite harmful to their health. The microorganisms found within honey can also cause botulism in birds. Pasteurised honey doesn't contain the same microorganisms, but because it's been heated and treated, it lacks even the limited nutritional value wild honey provides. So take honey off the menu for your bird table. If you feel the birds need a little sugar in their diet, dried berries or fruit are by far the safer options. Beans and pulses, although most are perfectly safe to feed our feathered friends, if they are uncooked, undercooked or dry, you run the risk of ruining their health. So make sure you steam or boil those beans before letting the birds stick their beaks in. Frying them is not the best idea for obvious reasons. When beans remain uncooked, particularly red kidney beans, they still contain high traces of a substance that is toxic to birds called hemagglutinin. Cooking the beans removes this substance common to many plants. Green beans, black beans, lentils, chickpeas and peas are the safest for birds. Although the birds can eat some undercooked beans, it's best not to take any chances. Remember not to feed the birds any beans you have cooked with salt, oil or added any seasoning to, because the salt, the oil and seasonings can be really bad for them. This sounds like you shouldn't feed birds at all, but it's just keep these things in mind, because it's wonderful to feed birds and have them come to your garden. But please don't let this put you off. There's just a lot of things that a lot of people don't put in their tables anyway, but sometimes people do. So I'm just trying to bring it to your mind that there's things you could avoid. If you really want to, just buy bags of good bird feed, and they're not that expensive. That's probably the best thing to give them anyway, but we can give them things from our cupboard if we've run out and it's too cold or it's too snowy or too icy to get to the shop. But just remember what I'm telling you. Dairy products. Well, it might be tempting to place that little bit of leftover milk in a saucer for them, or that little chunk of cheese, put that out for the birds on a bitterly cold morning. Your good intentions could, of course, have quite dire consequences. As a rule, most birds are lactose intolerant and cannot enjoy the creamy things in life without risk. Full-fat milk and soft cheese are especially harsh on them. Some birds can eat a little bit of this stuff when other food is hard to find, but in general, it's harsh in their system, and baby birds in particular should not be exposed to dairy products, so remember that in springtime. Although birds are big fans of worms, it's also not wise to put any sort of leftover raw meat in your feeders. They can begin to rot very quickly and cultivate some very harmful strains of bacteria, as you would imagine, of course. If you wish to give birds a protein kick, suet is a better choice to keep them energised and healthy. And lastly, everybody's favourite bird food, bread. Although bread doesn't poison birds, its real danger is that it doesn't really offer them any great nutritional value. And it's especially a problem in winter. The super fast metabolism of birds and their tiny stomachs require them to eat until they're completely full at every meal. Bread has a habit of quickly making them feel they couldn't take another bite and leave their feeder feeling satisfied and well fed, yet bread does not contain the magic combination of carbs, fats and proteins that they need to lead their high energy lifestyles. With a stomach full of empty, which is really what we're giving them, they're missing out on the real nourishment and calories that they need to keep warm, to fly and stay alive for the duration. On really cold days, when nutrition is difficult for birds to find, they get so little energy from eating only bread that they cannot keep warm, and that can actually kill them. So bread doesn't poison them, but it doesn't really feed them either, and in cold days it can be really difficult. Listen, there was nothing else. It's better than nothing. But to be honest, if you want to feed birds, I would say go and buy some suet balls, buy a bag of mixed seeds for birds and put them in your feeders. And another thing, keep your feeders clean. I can be a wee bit guilty of this myself by neglecting them, but keep your feeders clean them regularly, because wee birds can pick up diseases from these. If everybody eats from the same plate, it's the same idea. But little birds like greenfinches in particular are suffering through catching diseases from not quite so hygienic bird feeders. So keep your bird feeders clean as well. But I would suggest, if you're stuck, you don't have anything to feed them and you've got stuff in your cupboard or on that are scraps, feed them those, but make sure you're not giving them any of the stuff I've just mentioned here, just because it's there, because you can cause more damage than good, and that is nobody's intention when you're feeding birds. So if you can, buy a big bag of seed or a few fat balls and feed them to your birds. All of the birds. You should feed even the big ones. I'm not a great fan of magpies, but I won't let them starve either. So I'm just a wee sparrow. I'm froze to the marrow. I'm knackered and I'm just about dead. I've nothing to peck, so gi'e us a break and buy us a big bag of seed. This is Joe Murray from News for Scotland, signing off. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Joe. Now let's look at the Scottish Green Energy Awards for 2023. Scottish Renewables is the body which represents our renewables energy industry. They've just announced this year's winning projects over a dozen different categories, from Best Community Project to the Sustainable Development Award and many more. For full information on all the other winning projects and categories, look at www.scottishrenewables.com. But let's look at two of them. Knoydart in the northwest of Scotland is not connected to the national grid and generates all its own electricity. Other than some small run-of-the-burn micro-schemes in outlying hamlets, by far away the main producer and distributor of electricity on Knoydart is Knoydart Renewables Limited, which supplies electricity around Enquiry Bay. Knoydart Renewables was established in 1999 and inherited the old electrical generation and distribution systems from the previous estate owners. When the community-owned Knoydart Foundation bought the land, the system could only generate 50 or 60 kilowatts of electricity intermittently, and there were frequent power cuts. However, over the last 20 years, Knoydart Renewables has made 1.2 million of locally generated investment available to increase electricity generation up to 235 kilowatts and ensure a greater reliability of supply. Knoydart Renewables Limited is now engaged in a 2.7 million energy security project to further secure Knoydart's electricity supply for another 50 years and to allow them to generate up to 280 kilowatts. Knoydart Renewables won the Best Community Project Award. For more information, have a look at knoydart.org. And by the way, if you have any news for us, the email's info@newsforscotland.org. Let's look at one other award. The Innovation Award went to the engineers Geostructural for their patent-owned wind turbine repair system, which uses their Squifex technology. This is a flexible platform which allows repair and maintenance staff to be safely pulled up the tower of a wind turbine to get access to the blades. There are two sides to this tower, and as it moves up, it closes in over the blades, allowing the engineers to do repair work. If you want to know more about that and all of these other projects, just look up www.scottishrenewables.com. Now let's look at the Scottish Trad Awards, which I alluded to earlier. It's beginning to feel like awards night here. It's beginning to feel a lot like Christmas, eh? So who won this year's Traditional Music Awards? This year's Trads were held in the Caird Hall in Dundee. The Best Album of the Year award went to fiddle player Duncan Chisholm for his record The Black Coolin. His seventh album, the tunes draw their inspiration from Skye's famous mountain range. The brilliant Julie Fowlis, singer, Gael, whistle player and piper, was declared our Musician of the Year. Iona Fife, who's been on stage this year with a new high-tech electro sound, won the Singer of the Year prize, and Ailey McCormack is now a Gaelic Singer of the Year. The Best Live Act award went to Trail West for the lively Celtic rock performances. The Best Song of the Year, as we mentioned earlier, was a protest song, and its target was the Scottish Government. The Clearances Again by Skipponish and Vatersey fisherman Donald Francis MacNeil caused the Green Party and the government to think again about its marine protection policy, which would have put many small West Coast fishermen out of business. Skipponish won, government nil. Loads more prizes filled the evening, and again, to look at the rest of them, look at www.creativescotland.com. Okay, that's our news for this week. So on behalf of the team, Yvonne, Jeanette, Joe and myself, Hugh Stewart, thanks for listening. We'd really like to hear from you, so why not drop a quick comment either on our YouTube edition or on the Facebook page. And don't forget you can email us on info@newsforscotland.org. Remember, it's News for We Are. Okay, so from me, Hugh Stewart, thanks for listening. I'll be back next week. See you later.